Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. I am so glad to be able to be here with you. Here we are in the second week of November. The colors are still just fantastic. I just love this time of year. Tonight we are going to study a person in the Bible that we should take great interest in. This is from Dr. Claypool's book, Glad Reunion. And tonight we're going to look at our religious ancestor in the person of Saul. I have always been fascinated with his story for a lot of reasons, but it is really relevant to what is going on right now. We find ourselves in this pandemic. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, but we also, because of the pandemic and other reasons, we find ourselves in a time where the suicide rate is really going up, which is so sad. And one of the reasons that we can trust the Bible so much is because it is so real to life. These are not mythical figures that we are looking at. These are real people. And it just so happens in this story that Saul, in the end, ended up committing suicide. He went from being the first king of Israel to killing himself. How does that happen? Well, we're going to look at that tonight. And as it unfolds, you are going to be really surprised at how relevant this story is all these thousands of years later. Well, when someone commits suicide, we always want answers. Why was that the case? And sometimes we can write it off a little too quickly. Well, obviously they were just mentally ill or crazy. But saying that generally does not give us the kind of answers that helps us to understand more fully and to feel better about it. So let's look at this person of Saul, where he started, where he ended up, and let's see the kind of life lessons that come out of this. Saul was a sharp looking guy. That's one of the reasons he became the first king. Dr. Claypool describes it this way. He says, at the outset of his career, Saul seemed to possess all the ingredients necessary for a successful life. He was an impressive man physically, handsome, literally head and shoulders taller than the average Hebrew. He was deeply religious, courageous in battle, and had that charismatic flair that enabled him to inspire other people to action. So he was a big guy, a good-looking guy, tall guy. I happened to come across this quote: men in America that are over 6 feet are only make up 15% of the population, but they make up over 85% of the CEOs of the corporations. Isn't that interesting that people see in people's stature a kind of strength, and that gives them some advantages. And Saul had this advantage in the beginning. But let's get in the context of the time period when he became the first king and why that was the case. Well, the Philistines had produced weapons in their army and were beginning to expand. The Israelite people had not done that, and they were on the brink of going back into slavery. Something had to be done. Samuel was their leader at the time, and he said, listen, you don't want to have a king. All of these things are going to happen, but the people insisted on it, and so Samuel finally relented and allowed Saul to become king. So why would someone who started out this way end up being utterly defeated and embittered? And this can help us to understand ourselves and other people from the beginning. So he lists three things that help give us some insight into this. And first was this idea that eventually despair settled into Saul, and it may have resulted partly from some unrealistic expectations he had for what his kingship was going to look like. In other words, if you have if your expectations are too big walking into things, then a lot of times you end up being disillusioned about what you can and cannot do. He mentions the verse that in 1 Corinthians that we can only know in part. And that's not just confined to our knowledge. That is also in our achieving as well. We achieve in part. Who of us has not gone through that? We walk into a job with a lot of idealism, and sometimes we can do a lot of good, but it's rarely do we achieve everything. And so Saul's reign was only the first step in a long process that took decades to complete, and he was there to play a part in it, but he failed to realize this fact and judge his achievements by too high of a standard. Disillusionment is almost always the child of illusion, is how he puts it. So if you start with a wrong assumption, you're very likely to end up with a mistaken conclusion. He says, who of us ever fulfills our fondest dreams totally or completely? We have a part to play, but not a total part, and wise is the one who senses this and comes to terms with it. Apparently, Saul never did this, which may be why he seemed more of a failure to himself than he really was. A second contributing factor to Saul's tragic end may have been the kind of support that Saul received after becoming king. You know, Samuel was someone who could have been a mentor to him, but remember, Samuel really didn't want to do this in the first place. He didn't want to have a king. He made the right decision to do it because Israel needed an army in order to protect their race, but he really didn't help him along the way, and he kind of undermined him as well. So, you know, when King David became king, he had Nathan, who was a helpful critic, but he helped him along the way. Samuel just kind of put him out there and let him hang himself. And I want you to hear how he describes it, because this is exactly what happens in so many Baptist churches. He says, Samuel did not really help him find his way on this new frontier of leadership. In fact, what we see here so often happens in life. A person is given a difficult job by a group, and instead of struggling with him or her, the group sits back and lets him struggle alone until he at last hangs himself, and at that point they move in and reject him when it's too late to salvage anything. I cannot tell you how often this happens with churches. A lot of times Baptist churches who are making their own decisions, remember, no hierarchy, they go through some tough times when they lose a pastor. And so the pastor search committee is put together. They bring somebody in, and they don't give them the kind of support they need to be successful. They kind of just give them a whole lot to do. And in effect, what they often say to them without realizing it is, we want to be able to do the same thing and expect a different result, and we're going to put you in charge of that. So in other words, they may not allow the new person to make any kinds of changes, to do anything differently. They want to be able to do the same thing and expect a different result and expect the pastor to do that. So they just sit and wait, and if things don't go their way, then they pick them to pieces. That's one of the reasons why the average stay for a Baptist pastor is about 4.5 years, because they go through these same patterns over and over again. I can tell you that is absolutely not the case at our church. Our church has been so healthy in this past 9 or 10 years, and we are just really, really in a healthy place. In part because people want to help me, want to help Naomi, want to help Adam be successful, particularly during this time of pandemic, which has just turned our whole world upside down. Well, back to Saul, what Samuel did was give him criticism and negative judgment and then rejection after the fact. He says, what we'll see in the next chapter, that Saul's successor to the throne, King David, had this prophet Nathan, but Nathan worked with David, not against him, helped him to be successful and to move along. Well, this third factor was Saul's inadequate view of himself and of his place in the economy of God's purpose. He quotes this verse out of 1 Corinthians 15:10, by the grace of God, I am what I am. You can also hear that and believe it this way: by the grace of God, I am what I am, and I am where I am. Saul was never able to really take his place in the world, and our peace is in our place, accepting the fact that God chose us to live when and where we do. In other words, this is not a gray area. We were either chosen to live when we were born and during this time, or it is a complete coincidence. And none of us believe that it's a coincidence. God chose us to live during this time. Why would God choose us to live during this terrible pandemic? I don't think God made this pandemic happen. I do believe that we were chosen to live during this time. And what might that look like for me? It might look like for me to lead the church through what this time may look like. It may be to be a role model for my girls if they have to go through something like this in the future. They have seen me go through it and handle it effectively. Anytime I'm talking counseling with somebody who has kids and they're going through a rough time, I would say, is it a possibility that your child is going to have to go through this? And of course the answer is yes. And then I say, what's your job to do now is to model what that should look like. So if your kid ever has to go through it, then they have a model of seeing someone handle it effectively. Well, he says, our peace is in our place, and Saul was never able to come to a positive sense of that reality. He ends by saying, if our place is created for us by God, we do not have to fight to keep it any more than we have to fight to create it. It is ours for the assuming. But Saul did not grasp this, and so towards the end of his life, he fell into a jealousy of David that ultimately destroyed him. Think about him. David loved him, wanted nothing more than to help him. Saul should have seen him as an absolute blessing. He was a faithful servant. He was effective in the military. He said the same reason that kept Saul from taking his place in the world made him fearful that someone else would, and so he became absolutely paranoid, turning from his real enemies, the Philistines, to one that was not an enemy at all, David. David considered him like a father. He said, back of much of the hesitant conformity and insecure jealousy of our day stands with this same yawning chasm, our unwillingness to be ourselves and to occupy the place that is our peace. Self-doubt, which grows into self-despising, is the root problem behind so many of our present-day disorders, and nothing short of hearing the Genesis 1 account of our own creation can answer such a need. He says, listen, you are here because God wants you to be here. Before the foundation of the earth, it was decided that you would be you and occupy your particular place in the great drama creation. You did not earn this place, nor can anyone take it away from you. Your peace is in your place, God's gift to you and to you alone. If Saul could have seen himself in this light, what a difference it would have made. With that, he could have handled his own achievements more gracefully and allowed the criticism and lack of support he received to be what it was, his critics' problems and no reflection of his worth. But he did not love himself enough. He never affirmed in the depth of his soul the most basic truth of all. By the grace of God, I am what I am, and I am where I am. That is where our peace is. And we find that kind of peace through our commitment to Jesus Christ and to doing his will in our life. I hope this message finds you well in a troubled time, and I hope to be with you again soon. Go in peace.